Hi, I'm Jeremy Serrier and this is CRE Invested. Welcome to Module 9, Qualifying the Owner. Now, one of the challenges when you start receiving calls or inquiries from owners that want to sell you their properties is that you don't really know what their motivation is. In fact, reading an owner's mind can be quite difficult. So what we're going to cover in this module is a couple of things. One is how to qualify the owner using a 6-step process that we use. It's very, very useful for getting down to the nitty-gritty motivation of why the owner in fact wants to sell the property. Now, we're also going to talk about two psychological tools that we use when we're talking to an owner. We're going to give you a very powerful question to ask when you're asking about the pricing of the property. And then what we're going to do is talk about how to navigate all the stakeholders that are involved in making the decision about the commercial real estate and then ultimately making the deal. Now, you've been out doing marketing, you've got your strategy all lined up, your financial target is boxed in, and now you've been implementing tactics offline and online. You're talking to brokers, you've recruited one or two to help you source deals, and now you've got a problem. The problem is that the phone's actually ringing and people are emailing you, presenting you with opportunities. Once you've established contact with these owners, what do? Well, you got to have a process to qualify them. Our 6-step process goes like this. First, you establish a relationship with the owner. Then you move on to setting an agenda for how the conversation is going to go. Next, you go into probing the actual motivations that owner has for selling his or her property to you. Then you get to the money discussion. How much do they want for the property and what kind of terms are they willing to offer? After you've gone through the money step, you get into the involvement portion. The involvement portion is identifying all the stakeholders that would have an interest in the property, and interest or let's say influence, and making sure that they've been addressed and that they've been brought into the conversation, because the last thing you would want to have happen is for them to blow your deal up after you get this far. And then the 6th step being the actual deal consummation, structuring the transaction. Now let's begin with the first step, which is the relationship. When you open up the dialogue with the seller of the property that you're about to buy, you need to establish some form of relationship. And the best way to do that is to share your story. Now, you have your story because you've gone through Module 2's targeting and why exercise, so you have this strategy and you know why you're going to be pursuing the specific property that you're pursuing. When you first talk to this owner, one of the things you want to do is introduce yourself in a similar way to what we talked about in the broker module. And that is, share who you are, what your name is, what your strategy is, and why you actually want to invest in commercial real estate, particularly this piece of property. When you make it personal, one of the things that you do is you tear down a barrier that already exists between you and the owner. You see, right now the owner sees you as an adversary. Owners can kind of be like card players. They don't want to show you their hand. They may tell you a little bit about what they're looking to do, but they don't want to tell you much because they're a little concerned that if they reveal too much, it could jeopardize their negotiating position. You're going to diffuse that right away by saying, look, I'm here to do business and I don't want to mess around. This is really what I'm here to accomplish. This is why I want to buy, and if you're interested in selling, I'd like to have a conversation with you. When you do that, it gives you the opportunity to build a connection, and that connection becomes trust. And where there's trust, you have the foundation for what could be a promising investment opportunity. Step 2 is setting the agenda. Now that you have a relationship with this owner, although it may be just a new one, you need to set the agenda for what you're actually going to talk about. And one of the things that this does is it diffuses some of the uncertainty over what kind of questions you might ask or what the options in that discussion might be. So when you set your agenda, what you want to do is say, look, I'm going to come out, we're going to sit down, I want to take a look at your property, I'm going to talk to you, I'm going to ask you some questions, you're going to ask me some questions. What we'll do at that point is we'll probably have spent about 45 minutes together, and if you decide that at the end of that conversation you do not want to sell me your property, no hard feelings, that's fine. And if I decide I'm not interested, I'm just going to tell you. But let's agree that at the end of the conversation, we're either going to agree that yes, we're going to move forward and talk some more, or no, we're not going to talk any further, and I'm just going to go ahead and move on. Now, when you give that opportunity to the owner and you explain this up front, not only have you diffused some of the uncertainty about how the meeting might go, but you've also given that person an out. And they have the right at any point to say no. Now, of course, they're going to know they can say no, but people typically are uncomfortable to say no. So when you open it up and give them the opportunity, you really diffuse the situation, and you create a level playing field. Now, moving into step 3, you have your motivational exploration. Now, exploring motivations can be a challenge because, as you know, most owners, when you go straight in and ask them, why are you selling the property, they're going to give you some answer that probably isn't really the reason. Unless they're extraordinarily motivated, they're usually not going to tell you that. Sometimes you'll hear people say, yeah, well, I've got to sell because my wife is sick and I've just lost my job, and if I don't sell, I'm going to lose a building. That's an extraordinarily highly motivated owner who's selling the property. The reason why you hear stories like that is because those are remarkable, and if you find one, that's great. But most of the time, you're going to encounter owners who are going to say, yeah, I don't have to sell, but, or they're going to say, I kind of like having the cash flow, but, and then what you need to do is start to probe, because there's a reason why they reached out to you. They called you because there's something going on, and you need to find out what that is. So you need to be curious, and how do you do that? Well, look at children, for example. Children are great information gatherers. They ask a lot of questions. They're very curious. So in order to gain the information you're looking for, just be curious. Just ask questions. Also be respectful in how you ask them. When you're talking to an owner, just be nurturing and thoughtful. And when you're doing that, repeat back to them what they may have said to you. Show them you're listening. And when you do that, they're going to start to share more information with you. Now, when you start to get more information, you want to go deeper with it. And one technique that we use is using the 5 whys technique. So let's look at an example here. You have an owner who calls you up and says, I'm interested in selling my building. I notice that you're buying, and if you're interested, make me an offer. You say, okay, well, that's great. After you build your relationship, you establish your agenda, you go out and you sit down and you say, okay, you called me, tell me why you called me in the first place. You're opening with a question. The guy says, well, I'm calling because I'm interested in selling. All right, well, great. Well, tell me a little bit more about why you're interested in selling your property. The owner's going to tell you, well, I saw that you're buying and I thought you might want to make me an offer, so what do you think? What that owner's trying to do is float you up and keep you out of the core motivation discussion. Your job is to get into that core motivation and really find out why. So here's how you can do it. Well, why don't you tell me a little bit about why you bought the property in the first place? And they go on to explain the story about how they found it and why they bought it. Why did you decide to keep the property for so long? And as you start to go into this, you're going to find out information that's going to take you into the emotional core of why the owner bought, owns, and is thinking of selling the property. That emotional driver is what you want to identify. And when you can do that, you can start to get to the core motivator. And when you access that core motivator, now you can turn them around and start to find out what you can do to create a successful transaction. Now, let's go to another technique. This is called, I call this FIFA. The FIFA technique is a fact, interpretation, feeling, action, outcome technique. This is a very good way to work with an owner when you're down into that 5 why category to find out exactly how they're feeling about the property and what they want to see happen. But in order to get there, the very first thing you need to do is establish the chain of facts. You establish the chain of facts by going back and asking these questions, such as, tell me about why you bought the property in the first place. When did you buy it? How much did you pay for it? What kind of tenants have you had? How much rent do they pay? And what you're doing is building up a fact base. Now, when you move the conversation over to the interpretation step, what you're doing here is you're talking through how the owner perceives his role and ownership of the property. And when you start to uncover that, you see a story develop that they're telling themselves about the property. Most motivated sellers have a negative story they're telling themselves. They're telling themselves that they shouldn't own the property anymore for any number of reasons. You want to access that story, and that story will exist in that interpretation step. Now, once you've accessed that interpretation step, you can just ask them, so how do you feel about that? How do you feel about the fact that the tenant vacated and they stopped paying you rent early? And the guy's going to tell you, well, I'm angry about it, okay? And how's that affected you? And then he's going to say, well, it's hurting financially because I don't have cash flow to pay the mortgage. Okay, so tell me, fourth step, action. What would you like to see happen as a result of this? Now you're moving the owner from the core motivation step into a proactive direction that is essentially giving you the outline or framework for what a transaction should look like. Now, when you get these reasons, and you have 3 to 5 of them, and you're able to identify a path moving forward, you will now have the opportunity to step into the most powerful component here, which is the money component. Now, you've probably heard people tell you that the best question to ask is, hey, if I can come and pay cash and I can close in 2 weeks, what's the lowest price you'll take? Now, that's a good question and it does work, but there's a question that's more powerful than that. The question is, at what price would it make sense for you not to sell the property? Now, when you ask the question this way, in the negative form, what price would it make sense not to sell the property? What you're doing there is you're taking the owner into an uncomfortable space. It's a space that he or she hasn't wanted to think about because it's the low end of where their value spectrum is, how they perceive the value of the property. What they've been doing is they've been reassuring themselves that the property has a higher value than what you're most likely willing to pay. In order to move them from that place and get them down into a value range so you can qualify them to see if this is actually an opportunity you are interested in pursuing, you need to take them down to find out where their base number is. When you get to that base number, you can begin to ask questions and really feel around to see if there's an opportunity for you to make a financial deal. So, a few other questions on the money side you can ask. Does the owner have cash to bring to closing if necessary? Sometimes the owner's upside down. What does the owner think the property is worth? That's another way to ask the same question we just asked. Does the owner need all cash at closing, or could the owner take the payments over time? That's a great question to find out if they're an owner financing candidate. And what's the owner planning to do with the cash? When you know that, sometimes you can structure terms and conditions that are more financially advantageous for you, but also address the plans that the owner has. And when you can do those two together, you put them together, it really gives you the opportunity to make a financial transaction that's sound and that solves both sets of issues. So, moving into the involvement category. The involvement category is another piece of this that many deals fall apart at. What tends to happen is you'll go in and talk to someone who owns a property, only to find out weeks later that there's another owner, or the wife has the say, or there's a partner somewhere who has to be involved in the decision. What you need to do is make sure that you invite the team, all the stakeholders who are involved in making the decision about the property or influencing the decision about the property, to the table. Get them to come to the meetings. Make sure they're involved in the conversation. One of the best ways to ensure that your deal is going to go through with the owner you're working with is, if you're talking to the husband, invite the wife. If you're talking to the wife, invite the husband. Because what you're going to do there is get both of them in the room together, getting the same information and making decisions together. When they leave and they start communicating back and forth to one another, if one has not been in the meeting, they're going to create a whole new set of problems and objections for you that you really don't need. So a few questions you can ask to find out if those people are in the background. Ask who else will be signing the deed at closing. Who else will the owner consult about the sale? Will he call brokers, attorneys, financial planners, accountants, or friends? Be sure to include all of those stakeholders when you do that. The last step, step 6, is to sew the deal together. So when you're making the deal, all you're doing here is stepping back to the very beginning. You're going to review the information you've gathered with the owner. You can do this by restating the 3 to 5 reasons why the owner wants to sell. Remind the owner why he called you in the first place. Talk about the money conversation. You've gone through various sets of questions and you've gotten information about what financial expectations are set. And then start to craft the deal. You have a scenario where you've got the involvement of the stakeholders. You can start to craft a deal that addresses their qualitative concerns, the concerns they have about how the transaction will take place and what they're going to get. You can also address that piece financially and show them partner breakouts, net proceeds, and then remind them why they called you and why they want to sell the property to you in the first place. Once you've done that, you've created a deal that is really going to be tight. You're not going to have a problem with new information coming up because you've qualified the person who's making that decision. Now, one of the things that I do want to emphasize when you're putting a structure like this together is if at any point along the process, in the 6-step process, you run into issues where you're not getting the information you need, the owner is not answering your questions, the stakeholders aren't showing up, or the financial money component just doesn't make sense, throw it away. Walk from the deal. Don't get overly invested in a deal that's just not going to happen. If you get rid of them fast, you're going to have more time to focus on deals that can make you money. Now, the last thing I have to say about making the money is when you're qualifying the owner, you're really focused on uncovering the problems they have. And when you can solve someone's problem, you can do business and you can make money. So that's qualifying the owner. In our next session, what we're going to talk about is a case study. We're actually going to get into the nitty-gritty of a scenario where we have a target, we have an objective, we have tactics that have been implemented, and we're going to analyze a specific property that comes in from a marketing campaign and see whether it hits the target or not. I'm Jeremy Serrier. You've been watching CRE Invested's Module 9 on qualifying the owner. Thank you, and I look forward to seeing you at Module 10.